Hello, kids. Once again, I am going to start reading from a book for you. But this is a bit different. Isn't those short kids' books? This is actually my kids' novel, The Elements of Bree. Brienne always knew she was different. What she didn't know was that she was not from this world. She was from a world of monsters, magic, and adventure. Now she must return to save her homeland, restore the elements, and discover her destiny. So each day I will read a chapter from the book so you can all see the adventure that Bree goes on. I'd like to start off with a big shout out to Roger Boucher for his amazing artwork. And you can actually see the note that I wrote for Samantha coming through on here. And this is the map of the book for gold. Here we go. The Sea Monster. Brienne McKay knew she was different the day she killed a monster from the sea. She lived in a small fishing village called Passerelle, nestled at the base of the set of hills near the Atlantic Ocean. The name was in a language called French, but it was never pronounced with a French accent, or properly. In fact, everyone in Passerelle spoke with a funny accent and had a funny way of life. Everyone, that is, except Brienne. She was a teenager and didn't fit in with anyone. While all the other kids went to a small school on the hill, she was homeschooled. Almost every kid in the village had both parents and lots of aunts and uncles. Brienne lived with her aunt, and that was it. She was always talked about in town because she didn't sound like everybody else. She didn't go to school, and many kids called her a tomboy. She didn't look like anyone in Passerelle, even her aunt. She had shorter hair than all the girls in town and never wore a ponytail. She liked to have some of her hair hang over her face, covering her eyes, and even most of the kids made fun of her for that too. She also didn't fit in because she acted differently than the other kids. She had amazing eyesight and never needed glasses. She was stronger than even some of the older teenage boys and can run faster than any kids in the village. Some of the adults would ask if she was a dancer after watching her walk, climb, and move along the rocky coastline with great agility and balance. Today, Brienne sat on a rock near the piers and watched the fishermen come in with their daily catch. As she watched, she would use her slingshot and try to hit snails crawling up the rocks near the water. She had excellent aim and made sure she would only knock the snails into the water and not crack their shells. When she ran out of targets, she looked to the dock nearby to see the fishermen coming in. Some days were terrible out on sea for fishing, but today was a good day. Every boat that came in had lots of fish, and the fishermen seemed very happy. As they went about dumping their catch into a large bin for the other workers to go through and prepare, Brienne stared at the unattended boats and considered stealing one for a joyride out to the ocean. She loved the ocean air and the smell of salt water. However, there were too many people on the pier for her to be successful today, so she decided to go home instead. She brushed the hair out of her eyes as she stood up. She needed to go home and help her aunt with supper. Tonight was a dish she didn't enjoy: goulash. Her aunt's recipe had noodles, tomato soup, spices, and corned beef. Having the corned beef was part of the traditional family recipe. And everyone else in the village used regular beef. She wasn't looking forward to it. The walk home began uneventful, as she decided to take a shortcut through the forest and across the small creek to get home. The only people out today were raking leaves and preparing for the winter that would come in a month or less. She kept her slingshot on, its arm brace still strapped to her jacket. As she walked, she could pick up a handful of pebbles from the road and fire at random knots on trees and deadfall deep in the forest. She detoured off the road and made her way to the creek that divided her aunt's land from her neighbor's land. There was an ancient small stone bridge that went over the creek that she would sometimes be brave enough to cross, but it was so old no one ever would dare to try and cross it. She could see the bridge as she slowly made her way down the embankment. As she easily jumped the creek, she heard her name. Bree. The voice was raspy and seemed to float on the air. She looked toward the bridge and could make out a figure underneath it. "Who's there?" she asked. The figure limped out of the shadows and glared at her. It was taller than her, all green and covered in seaweed. It had scales all over its body, with 2 long arms that ended in hands with 4 long fingers and sharp claws. Its face looked hideous. A large gaping mouth with sharp teeth had 2 large fish eyes on the top of its head. It wheezed and gurgled as it lurched forward. Brienne froze in place, not sure if she was really believing what she was seeing. As it got closer, she could see it was wounded. There were deep scratches all over its body, especially on the leg it was limping on. She suddenly caught a terrible smell of rotting fish that it gave off, and it made her want to gag. The creature began to move faster towards her, so Brienne backed away as she did it. She stumbled on the creek's embankment and dropped some of her pebbles. That reminded her that she had a weapon. She placed a larger pebble into her slingshot and fired it. It hit the creature, but it didn't seem to affect it. She fired more and more pebbles, hitting it every time, but it seemed to do no damage. It was getting closer and wanted to hurt her. She looked around her and finally saw a larger stone with some jagged edges on it. It was not too big to pick up and yet small enough to fit in the pouch of the slingshot. Any other time she would never fire something that big, as she knew it could hurt or do some serious damage. Today, with this strange sea creature approaching, she would make the exception. She knew it wanted to hurt her. How she knew was a mystery. In any event, she grabbed the rock, loaded it into the pouch, pulled back as far as possible, and fired at its head. Of all the things that could have happened when the rock hit the creature, the explosion of sparkles was not one that Brienne expected. The creature shook in place as the hole in its head sparkled and then began to glow. It made a strange noise and then exploded into a puff of sparkling green mist. As the mist fell, the color changed to a reddish gold as it collected into a small shimmering pile on the ground. The pile soon vanished as if it were sucked into the dirt below. For a few minutes, Brienne didn't move. What was that thing? How did it know her name? A sudden rustle in the trees from a chipmunk startled her. She turned around to see if there were any more of those creatures. No, she was alone. Finding her feet, she scrambled up the creek bank and ran to her aunt's house. Thank you. That is chapter 1. I will post chapter 2 either later today or even later this week. Enjoy.